The scrape of the fountain pen against the heavy parchment sounded unnervingly loud in the dead silence of courtroom 302. Across the scratched mahogany table, Richard's lips curled into a predatory, victorious smirk. He thought he had won. He thought he had executed the perfect betrayal, stripping her of everything: her dignity, her home, her financial future, and her sanity. As Sarah crossed the final T on the divorce settlement, sealing what looked like her total, humiliating ruin, a collective breath held in the room. But Richard's arrogant smile didn't last, because the moment the black ink dried, the Honourable Thomas Braddock didn't just strike his wooden gavel to dismiss them. He abruptly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, his face drained of colour, pointing a trembling finger straight at Richard. The real trial hadn't ended. It was just beginning. To the outside world, Richard and Sarah Calloway were the undisputed golden couple of Winnetka, Illinois. Their life was a meticulously curated exhibition of upper-class Midwestern success. Richard was the charismatic, relentlessly driven CEO of Calloway Logistics, a freight and shipping empire he had built from a single rusted warehouse into a regional powerhouse. Sarah was the elegant, devoted wife who had sacrificed her own promising career in commercial architecture to manage their sprawling, six-bedroom Tudor estate, host the crucial charity galas that fueled Richard's networking, and maintain the pristine image required of a rising corporate titan. For 12 years, Sarah believed they were a team. She believed the long nights Richard spent at the office, the sudden weekend business trips to Miami and Denver, and the increasingly separate lives they led were simply the necessary, unfortunate, collateral damage of building an empire. She trusted him implicitly. That was her first and nearly fatal mistake. The illusion shattered on a mundane Tuesday evening in late October. The autumn air outside was crisp, the leaves turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. But inside their custom-built chef's kitchen, the atmosphere was freezing. Sarah had just pulled a roast from the oven when Richard walked in. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't loosen his silk tie. He simply dropped a thick manila envelope onto the marble island. "I'm filing for divorce," Richard said, his voice as casual as if he were asking for a glass of water. "I want you out of the house by Friday." Sarah froze, the oven mitt still in her hands. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. "Richard, what are you talking about?" she managed to whisper, her mind desperately trying to process the words. "Is this a joke?" "I don't make jokes about my life, Sarah," he replied, leaning against the counter, exuding a terrifying calm. "I've outgrown this. I've outgrown you. I need someone who matches my current trajectory, not someone who reminds me of where I started." That someone was Jessica Croft, a 26-year-old junior vice president at his firm, whose primary qualification seemed to be her ruthless ambition and her willingness to stroke Richard's massive ego. But the infidelity, as agonizing as a knife twist to the gut, wasn't even the cruelest part of Richard's ambush. It was the paperwork inside the manila envelope. When Sarah numbly opened it, she found a petition for dissolution of marriage and a harsh reminder of the prenuptial agreement she had signed 12 years ago, back when they were both broke, back when Richard convinced her it was just a formality to protect a small inheritance he expected from his grandfather. The terms were draconian. According to Richard's high-priced shark-like attorney, a man named Harrison Vaughan, the prenup dictated that in the event of a divorce, Sarah would walk away with a flat payout of $100,000, her personal belongings, and a 5-year-old SUV. She would have no claim to the house, no claim to the investment portfolios, and absolutely zero equity in Callaway Logistics, a company she had practically co-founded, having drafted the initial business plans and designed their first 3 distribution centers for free. "You can't do this," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she scanned the documents. "We built this life together. You said the company was ours." Richard offered a small, patronizing smile. It was a smile she would come to despise with every fiber of her being. "I built the company, Sarah. You picked out the drapes for the office. There's a difference. Sign the waiver of temporary support by tomorrow, and I'll throw in an extra 20 grand to help you find an apartment. Fight me, and Vaughan will bury you in litigation until you can't afford to buy groceries." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah standing alone in the ruins of her life. For the first 24 hours, she wept until her chest ached. She mourned the man she thought she had married, the future she had envisioned, and the sheer injustice of it all. But when the tears finally stopped on Wednesday night, they were replaced by something entirely different. A cold, quiet, and terrifyingly focused anger. Sarah realized she had 2 choices. She could be the victim, the discarded wife fading into obscurity in a cheap 1-bedroom apartment, or she could fight. She wiped her face, poured herself a cup of black coffee, and opened her laptop. If Richard wanted a war, he was going to get one. The first step was finding the right general for her war. Sarah didn't go to the flashy downtown firms with billboards on the interstate. She went to a modest, unassuming brick building on the outskirts of the city to meet Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was a veteran family law attorney with a reputation for being an absolute bulldog in the courtroom. She was in her late 50s, wore practical reading glasses, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Illinois financial law. Sarah laid the manila envelope on Evelyn's desk. "My husband thinks he's leaving me with nothing. I know the prenup looks ironclad. But I know Richard. He is incredibly arrogant, and he loves his secrets." Evelyn reviewed the documents, her lips pursing into a tight line. "Harrison Vaughan drafted this? He's a slime ball, but he's a thorough slime ball. Breaking this prenup based on standard duress or unconscionability is going to be a massive uphill battle, Sarah. A judge will look at this and say, 'You were an adult when you signed it.'" "I don't want to break the prenup based on feelings," Sarah said, leaning forward. "I want to break it based on fraud." Evelyn peered over her glasses. "Go on." "Richard claims his net worth is roughly $8 million. He claims the logistics company has been taking heavy losses for the last 3 years due to supply chain issues," Sarah explained, pulling a notebook from her purse. "But that doesn't make sense. He's been taking frequent, unrecorded trips to the Cayman Islands. He installed a biometric safe in his home office that he forbade me from touching. And roughly 2 years ago, I noticed mail arriving for a company called Crescent Holdings, LLC, a company that isn't listed anywhere on his public financial disclosures." Evelyn's eyes gleamed. She smelled blood in the water. If he is actively hiding marital assets, or if he has commingled protected assets with hidden, illicitly gained funds, the entire prenup could be invalidated. But we need proof, Sarah. Ironclad, irrefutable proof. Not just suspicion. How do we get it? "We dig," Evelyn said, writing down a name on a legal pad, "and we hire a ghost." The ghost was a man named Gregory Shaw, a private investigator and former forensic accountant for the IRS, who specialized in hunting down offshore money. Hiring him drained almost all of Sarah's personal savings, the meager amount she had kept in a separate account from Richard. But she viewed it as an investment in her survival. While Richard paraded Jessica Croft around town, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, and finalizing his plans to move her into the Winnetka estate, Sarah moved into a small, cramped apartment in a less desirable zip code. She played the part of the defeated, broken woman perfectly. When Richard called to gloat or to pressure her into signing the final settlement, she kept her voice small, hesitant, and tearful. She let him believe he had utterly crushed her. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Gregory and Sarah were constructing a meticulous web of evidence. The breakthrough came not from a massive hack or a corporate leak, but from a fatal flaw in Richard's own arrogance. Years ago, he had discarded an old iPad. He thought he had wiped it, but he had merely logged out. Sarah had found it in the basement while packing her belongings. Working with Gregory, they managed to restore an old backup from the iCloud account connected to that device. Hidden deep within an innocuous-looking folder, labeled Golf Trip Itineraries, they found the motherlode. It was an encrypted ledger. It took Gregory 2 weeks to crack the password, which, ironically, was the date of Richard and Jessica's first secret vacation. But once they were in, the sheer scale of Richard's deception took their breath away. Richard wasn't just hiding money. He was running a highly sophisticated and highly illegal double billing scheme through Callaway Logistics. He was overcharging his biggest corporate clients, funneling the excess profits through Crescent Holdings LLC, and then wiring that money to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. He had siphoned nearly $14 million out of the marital estate and out of his clients' pockets over the past 4 years. Furthermore, the ledger detailed massive cash withdrawals used to purchase real estate in Jessica Croft's name, a luxury condo downtown and a lake house in Michigan. He was bleeding the legitimate company dry to fund a secret empire, deliberately tanking his on-paper net worth to ensure Sarah would get nothing in the divorce. "This isn't just grounds for invalidating the prenup," Evelyn said, staring at the printed spreadsheets laid out across her conference table. "This is wire fraud. This is tax evasion. This is federal prison time." Sarah looked at the numbers, a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. The man she had loved for over a decade was a complete fiction. "So, what do we do? Do we hand this over to the police?" Evelyn smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. "Not yet. If we report him now, the feds freeze everything, and you get tied up in criminal litigation for a decade. No, we play his game. We let him think he's winning. We let him get on the witness stand in family court, under oath, and swear that his financial disclosures are complete and accurate." "We let him commit perjury," Sarah realized. "Exactly," Evelyn said. "We build a trap, and we let his own arrogance spring it." The preliminary stages of the divorce proceeded exactly as Richard dictated. He strutted into mediation sessions, wearing custom-tailored Italian suits, his expensive lawyer, Harrison Vaughan, hovering beside him like a well-paid attack dog. Richard's strategy was psychological warfare. He wanted to exhaust Sarah, to drain her non-existent legal funds, and to humiliate her into capitulation. During the mandatory deposition, held in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Vaughan's high-rise office, Richard was at his most insufferable. Evelyn Reed sat across from him, projecting the aura of an overworked, outmatched public defender. Sarah sat silently beside her, hands folded in her lap, looking pale and exhausted. "Mr. Callaway," Evelyn began, her voice steady. "Let's review your statement of net worth. You have declared your total assets, including liquid cash, investments, and your valuation of Callaway Logistics, to be exactly $8,200,000. Is this correct?" "That is correct," Richard said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. He didn't even look at Evelyn. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, a smug, pitying expression on his face. "And you affirm, under penalty of perjury, that you hold no other bank accounts, offshore trusts or shell corporations, either domestically or internationally. I am a transparent businessman, Miss Reed. Richard scoffed, checking his gold Rolex. My financial life is an open book. As I've explained repeatedly, the logistics market has been punishing. I'm barely keeping the company afloat. Frankly, my offer of an extra $20,000 to Sarah is an act of extreme charity. I see, Evelyn said, making a brief note on her pad. And are you familiar with an entity named Crescent Holdings, LLC? Sarah watched Richard closely. For a fraction of a millisecond, the muscle in his jaw twitched. The smugness flickered, replaced by a microscopic flash of panic. But he recovered instantly, his sociopathic calm returning. Never heard of it, Richard lied, his voice barely changing pitch. Sounds like a real estate firm. And you have not purchased any property or transferred any funds for the benefit of a Ms. Jessica Croft? Harrison Vaughan slammed his hand on the table. Objection. This is a fishing expedition. My client's relationship post-separation is irrelevant to the division of assets dictated by the prenuptial agreement. We are merely inquiring about the dissipation of marital assets, Mr. Vaughan, Evelyn replied mildly. No, Richard interjected, waving his lawyer off. Let her ask. I want this on the record. No, Ms. Reed. I have not transferred any marital assets to Jessica. Any money she has is her own. It was a masterclass in deception. He lied fluently, confidently, and completely. By the time the deposition ended, Richard walked out of the room looking like a conqueror. He believed he had survived the only weak point in his armor. He believed Sarah's lawyer was grasping at straws, unaware that Evelyn had just recorded him committing multiple counts of felony perjury. In the weeks leading up to the final hearing, Richard grew increasingly bold. He stopped hiding Jessica. They attended charity galas together, the same galas Sarah used to organize. He began renovating the Winnetka estate, sending Sarah bills for the new landscaping, claiming it was property maintenance she owed under a bizarre interpretation of the prenup. He was twisting the knife, enjoying her perceived suffering. But Sarah didn't break. Every time she felt the urge to scream, she looked at the heavily encrypted flash drive sitting in her purse, the digital tombstone of Richard Calloway. They were assigned to the courtroom of the Honorable Thomas Braddock for the final settlement hearing. Judge Braddock was a man legendary in the Chicago legal circuit. A former Marine and a no-nonsense jurist, he had absolutely zero tolerance for people who wasted his time or lied in his courtroom. He was strict, traditional, and possessed an innate lie detector honed over 30 years on the bench. Evelyn had specifically maneuvered their scheduling to ensure they landed in his jurisdiction. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Chicago was a heavy, bruised gray, threatening an icy downpour. Sarah dressed carefully in a simple, modest navy suit. She wore minimal makeup. She looked exactly like what Richard wanted her to be, a woman who had given up. When they entered courtroom 302, the smell of lemon polish and old paper hung in the air. The heavy oak pews were empty, save for a few clerks whispering in the corner. Richard was already there, sitting at the respondents' table with Harrison Vaughan. Richard wore a charcoal pinstripe suit, his hair perfectly styled. He was laughing quietly at a joke Vaughan had just made. As Sarah took her seat next to Evelyn at the petitioner's table, Richard caught her eye. He didn't look away. Instead, he offered that same chilling smile, the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into the trap. He mouthed the words, "It's over." Sarah held his gaze for a second, feeling a sudden, strange sense of absolute calm wash over her. She gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Richard, she thought, reaching out to touch the heavy, leather-bound folder Evelyn had just placed on the mahogany table. "It is over." "All rise," the bailiff barked, breaking the heavy silence. "The family court of Cook County is now in session. The Honourable Judge Thomas Braddock presiding." Judge Braddock emerged from chambers, his black robes billowing slightly. He was a tall man with a shock of white hair and piercing, hawkish eyes. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusting his reading glasses as he surveyed the room. The atmosphere instantly tightened, the gravity of the law descending upon them. "Be seated," Judge Braddock commanded, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant respect. He opened the file in front of him. "We are here for the final decree and settlement in the matter of Calloway versus Calloway. Let's get this done. Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" The trap was set. The stage was lit, and Richard Calloway was about to step right onto the landmine he had built for himself. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 remained firmly shut, sealing the players inside a quiet arena where futures were dismantled and rebuilt. Judge Thomas Braddock peered over his reading glasses, his expression a mask of judicial fatigue that disguised a razor-sharp intellect. He leafed through the preliminary filings, his brow furrowing slightly at the stark imbalance of the proposed settlement. "Counsel," Judge Braddock rumbled, his voice echoing off the wood-panelled walls, "I have before me a petition for dissolution of marriage, accompanied by a property settlement agreement that leans heavily, and I mean heavily, on a prenuptial agreement drafted 12 years ago. Mr. Vaughan, I assume you are the architect of this document." Harrison Vaughan stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a practiced flourish. "I am, Your Honor. The agreement is standard, fully executed, and legally binding under Illinois law. My client, Mr. Calloway, built his enterprise through his own singular efforts. The prenuptial agreement was designed to protect those premarital assets and the subsequent growth of his business. We have offered a generous settlement of $100,000, a fully paid 2018 SUV, and all of the petitioner's personal effects to expedite this matter." Braddock looked from Vaughan to Sarah. "Generous is a subjective term, Mr. Vaughan. Miss Reed, does your client understand the finality of what she is about to sign? This effectively leaves her with a fraction of a % of the marital estate." Evelyn stood slowly, her demeanor respectful but subdued. She was playing her part beautifully. "She does, Your Honor. We have reviewed the prenuptial agreement extensively. Given the financial affidavit submitted by the respondent, which claims significant recent corporate losses and a constrained net worth, my client feels she has no financial avenue to pursue protracted litigation." Richard visibly relaxed at the respondent's table. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossing one ankle over his knee. The tension that had coiled in his shoulders for weeks evaporated. He shot a glance at his lawyer, an almost imperceptible nod of triumph passing between them. He had done it. He had starved her out, intimidated her legal counsel, and successfully safeguarded his hidden fortune. "Very well," Judge Braddock said, though his tone betrayed a hint of distaste. He hated prenuptial agreements that left one spouse destitute, but his job was to interpret the law, not to act as a moral arbiter, unless the law had been broken. "Before we proceed to the final signatures, I require Mr. Calloway to swear, under oath, and for the final record of this court, to the absolute accuracy of his financial disclosures." "Of course, Your Honor," Richard said, standing up smoothly. He raised his right hand. The court clerk stepped forward. "Do you swear that the financial affidavits and disclosures you have provided to this court represent a complete, truthful, and accurate accounting of all your assets, liabilities, and holdings, both domestic and foreign?" "I do," Richard stated clearly, his voice projecting confident sincerity. "And you affirm that there are no hidden accounts, shell corporations, or undisclosed transfers of marital property?" Judge Braddock added, staring directly into Richard's eyes. Richard didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze with the practiced ease of a man who lied for a living. "I affirm, Your Honor. Every penny is accounted for." "Thank you. You may be seated," Braddock said, picking up his pen. "Ms. Calloway, the bailiff will bring the final settlement decree to your table. Once you signed this, the prenuptial agreement is enforced, the marriage is dissolved, and the terms are locked. There is no going back." The bailiff, a burly man in a pressed uniform, carried the thick stack of paper across the room. He placed it gently on the scratched mahogany table in front of Sarah. A heavy, gold-plated fountain pen lay beside it. The silence in the courtroom grew absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system and the distant wail of a police siren outside. Sarah looked down at the documents. The words swam before her eyes for a moment. Dissolution, waiver of alimony, forfeiture of equity. This was the piece of paper that erased 12 years of loyalty, 12 years of building a life, 12 years of loving a man who viewed her as disposable. She looked up at Richard. He was watching her intently. And then he did it. The mask of the polite, regretful businessman slipped. Richard Calloway's lips curled into a predatory, victorious smirk. It was a smile of pure malice, a silent communication that said, "I won. You are nothing." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made her fingertips tingle. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the fountain pen. She pressed the gold nib to the heavy parchment, the scrape of the metal sounding unnervingly loud in the dead silence of the room. She signed her name with fluid, elegant strokes. She pushed the paper away. Richard's smile widened. He turned to Vaughan and whispered something, likely a congratulatory remark about hitting the golf course by noon. "The petitioner has signed," Judge Braddock noted, reaching for his wooden gavel. "Having reviewed the documents, I am prepared to enter this decree into the—" "Your Honor," Evelyn Reed's voice sliced through the courtroom like a gunshot. It was no longer the subdued, defeated tone of an overworked lawyer. It was sharp, authoritative, and utterly commanding. Judge Braddock paused, his gavel hovering inches above the sounding block. He peered over his glasses at Evelyn. "Yes, Ms. Reed, the documents are signed. The matter is largely concluded." "The matter of the divorce may be concluded, Your Honor," Evelyn said, standing up to her full, imposing height. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out 3 massive, identical binders, their spines straining against the weight of the paper inside. "But the matter of the respondent's massive, coordinated, and ongoing financial fraud against both my client and the federal government has just begun." The air in courtroom 302 instantly crystallized. Richard's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of sudden, rigid confusion. Harrison Vaughan leaped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. "Objection! What is this?" Vaughan sputtered, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, the settlement is signed. Opposing counsel is completely out of order. This is a desperate, post-agreement theatrical stunt." "Sit down, Mr. Vaughan," Judge Braddock barked, his eyes locked on the enormous binders Evelyn was hauling toward the bench. "Ms. Reed, you just used the words financial fraud and federal government in my courtroom immediately after a sworn oath. You had better have a spectacular explanation, and it had better not waste my time." "It won't, Your Honor," Evelyn said calmly, handing one binder to the clerk to pass up to the judge and dropping the second one onto Vaughan's table with a resounding thud. I allowed the signing of that document, and I allowed Mr. Calloway to take that final oath to irrevocably establish his perjury on the record. What you hold in your hands is a verified forensic accounting report compiled by Gregory Shaw, a former IRS criminal investigator. Richard's face drained of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of an airplane and realized he forgot his parachute. He stared at the binder on his table as if it were a live explosive. "Turn to tab 4, Your Honor," Evelyn instructed, her voice ringing out in the dead silent room. You will find the encrypted internal ledgers of Calloway Logistics. They detail a systemic double billing scheme targeting his 3 largest corporate clients. Mr. Calloway was overcharging them by approximately 20%. "This is inadmissible garbage," Vaughan yelled, wildly flipping through the pages, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the bank logos, the routing numbers, the exact dates of transfers. "Where did you get this? This is a violation of privacy." It was retrieved from a discarded, unwiped iPad, legally belonging to the marital estate, Mr. Vaughan, Evelyn countered effortlessly. "No hacking was involved. Your client simply forgot to log out." Judge Braddock was reading rapidly, his jaw tightening with every page he turned. "Continue, Ms. Reed." "Tab 7, Your Honor," Evelyn said, stepping away from the bench and turning to look directly at Richard. The stolen funds were funneled into a Delaware shell corporation called Crescent Holdings, LLC. From there, the money was wired to 2 offshore accounts, one at the Banco Nacional de Panama and another in a Swiss Life private portfolio. The total amount siphoned from the legitimate company and thereby hidden from the marital estate is $14,250,000. A collective gasp echoed from the clerks in the corner. The bailiff instinctively took a step closer to Richard's table. "But that's not all," Evelyn pressed on, relentless. "If you look at tab 9, you will see domestic wire transfers from Crescent Holdings used to purchase a luxury condominium in downtown Chicago and a lakefront property in Michigan. Both deeds are registered to a Ms. Jessica Croft. Mr. Calloway testified under oath in his deposition, a transcript of which is at tab 12, and again in front of you 5 minutes ago, that he had no knowledge of Crescent Holdings and had transferred no assets to Ms. Croft." Richard was suffocating. The walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. He tried to speak, to formulate a lie, an excuse, a spin, but his throat was entirely dry. He looked at Harrison Vaughan for help, but his expensive shark of a lawyer was currently backing away from the table, physically distancing himself from his client. Vaughan knew that suborning perjury meant losing his license. He was abandoning ship. Judge Braddock stopped reading. He slowly closed the massive binder. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of procedure. It was the silence of a looming execution. Braddock looked down at Richard. The judge's hands were flat on the desk, his knuckles white. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. For a terrifying 10 seconds he didn't say a word. He just stared, letting the sheer weight of Richard's arrogance hang in the air. Then, the Honorable Thomas Braddock pushed his heavy leather chair back with a violent screech. He rose to his feet, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the bench. His face was devoid of color, pale with a cold, righteous fury. He raised his right hand and pointed a trembling finger straight at Richard Calloway's chest. "You." Braddock's voice was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "You had the unmitigated gall to walk into my courtroom, place your hand in the air, look me in the eye, and lie." "Your Honor, Richard choked out, his voice cracking. "Do not speak," Braddock roared, the sheer volume making the windows rattle. "You do not speak unless spoken to, Mr. Calloway. You have weaponized this court. You have used the legal system as a shield for a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. You have attempted to defraud your spouse, your clients, and the state of Illinois, and you expected me to stamp your paperwork and wish you a good day. Braddock turned to the clerk. Strike the final settlement from the record. I am invalidating the prenuptial agreement in its entirety based on egregious, premeditated fraud and the deliberate concealment of marital assets. Your Honor, my client. Vaughan started weakly. Mr. Vaughan, if I find out you had even a whisper of knowledge about Crescent Holdings, I will personally see to it that you are disbarred before the sun sets, Braddock snapped, silencing the lawyer instantly. Braddock turned his wrath back to Richard. The assets of Callaway Logistics, Crescent Holdings, and all personal accounts tied to Richard Callaway are hereby frozen immediately. A court-appointed receiver will take over your company by the end of the business day. Richard slumped back in his chair, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. The empire he had built, the perfect life he had curated, was disintegrating before his eyes in real time. He looked over at Sarah. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She was simply watching him, her eyes hard and cold, like a judge delivering a sentence he had long deserved. Furthermore, Judge Braddock continued, sitting back down and grabbing his pen with a vengeance, Ms. Reed, I am granting your motion for sanctions. But this is no longer just a family court matter. Bailiff, secure the doors. Clerk, I want a full transcript of today's proceedings, along with these 3 binders, couriered immediately to the Financial Crimes Division of the United States Attorney's Office in Chicago. I believe the FBI and the IRS will be highly interested in Mr. Callaway's business acumen. Richard buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic moan escaped his lips. The reality of federal prison was suddenly staring him in the face. The luxury condos, the Swiss accounts, the trips to the Cayman Islands. It was all gone. Court is adjourned, Judge Braddock declared, striking his gavel with a force that sounded like a gunshot. The sharp crack finalized the destruction of Richard Callaway. As the judge swept out of the courtroom, Sarah slowly stood up. She buttoned her simple navy suit jacket. She picked up her purse. She felt lighter than she had in 12 years. Evelyn turned to her, a small, fiercely proud smile on her lips. Ready to go? Yes, Sarah said. She walked past Richard's table without a single backward glance, stepping out of the heavy oak doors and into the rest of her life. The machinery of federal justice is often described as slow, but when handed a perfectly wrapped, impeccably documented gift of corporate fraud and tax evasion by a furious state judge, it moves with terrifying velocity. By 2:30 p.m. that same afternoon, the crisp autumn air outside the glass-fronted headquarters of Callaway Logistics was shattered by the screeching of tires. 6 dark, unmarked sedans formed a blockade at the main entrance and the loading docks. Men and women wearing navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRSCI emblazoned across their backs swarmed the building. They moved with coordinated, silent efficiency, carrying stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and heavy plastic bins. Inside his corner office, completely oblivious to the impending raid, Richard was in the middle of a frantic, screaming phone call. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his normally pristine desk was covered in hastily scribbled notes. He was trying to reach his contact at the Swiss Life private bank, desperately attempting to initiate a wire transfer to move the funds from Crescent Holdings to a non-extradition jurisdiction before Judge Braddock's orders could propagate through the international banking system. "Listen to me, you idiot!" Richard bellowed into his cell phone, pacing like a caged animal. "I am authorizing the transfer. I don't care what the compliance department says. You move that money to the shell in Dubai right now, or I will." The heavy mahogany door to his office didn't just open. It was thrust open with enough force to crack the drywall behind it. Special Agent David Ross, a man whose stern face looked like it was carved from granite, stepped into the room. He held a piece of paper in his hand. Behind him, 3 armed agents immediately fanned out, securing the filing cabinets and Richard's computer terminals. "Richard Calloway?" Agent Ross asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my office!" Richard snapped, dropping his phone onto the desk. "Security. Where is security?" "Your security staff is currently being interviewed in the lobby," Ross replied, stepping forward and flashing his badge. "I'm Special Agent Ross with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Internal Revenue Service. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant on these premises, your residence, and any properties affiliated with Crescent Holdings, LLC." Richard's stomach plummeted into an endless, icy abyss. The phone on his desk beeped. The Swiss banker had hung up. You can't do this. My lawyer, your lawyer, Mr. Harrison Vaughan, formally withdrew as your counsel 20 minutes ago, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest regarding your sworn statements in family court, Ross informed him, his tone brutally factual. He also forwarded us the contact information for your newly appointed public defender. Now, step away from the desk, keep your hands where I can see them, and do not touch another piece of electronic equipment. Within an hour, the king of Callaway Logistics was escorted out of his own building. He wasn't in handcuffs yet. The formal indictment would take a few days to draft, but the humiliation was absolute. Hundreds of his employees, the people he had bullied, underpaid, and lied to, lined the glass corridors, watching in stunned silence as their untouchable CEO was marched out by federal agents holding boxes of his hard drives. With his corporate empire seized by a court-appointed receiver and his bank accounts frozen solid, Richard had only one lifeline left: Jessica Croft. The real estate was in her name. If he could convince her to sell the lake house quickly, they could use the cash to hire a decent criminal defense attorney and mount a fight. He took an Uber. He couldn't access the company cars to Jessica's luxury downtown condominium. The ride was agonizing, every traffic light mocking his sudden powerlessness. When he arrived at the penthouse suite, he didn't bother knocking. He used his key and burst through the door. "Jess, we have a massive problem. We need to—" Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The sprawling, modern living room was a disaster zone of designer luggage. 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases were open on the floor, and Jessica was frantically tossing cashmere sweaters and silk dresses into them. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and cold calculation. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "I saw the news alerts on my phone, Richard. The raid on the company. The receiver being appointed," Jessica said, her voice completely devoid of the cloying affection she usually reserved for him. She zipped up a makeup bag and tossed it into a suitcase. "The FBI called my cell phone 10 minutes ago. They asked if I was aware that the deed to this condo was purchased with funds derived from wire fraud. Jess, listen to me, we can fix this. I just need you to liquidate the Michigan property. It's in your name. They can't touch it immediately." Jessica let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It was a sound that sliced through Richard's remaining delusion. "Are you insane? They can absolutely touch it, Richard. It's the proceeds of a crime. If I try to sell that house, I become an accessory to federal money laundering. I'm 26 years old. I am not spending the best years of my life in a federal penitentiary because you couldn't keep your greed in check." "I did this for us," Richard yelled, stepping toward her. "I hid that money so we could have a life." You did it for yourself, Jessica snapped back, slamming the lid of a suitcase shut. You used my name as a shield. Well, I'm not playing the shield anymore. I told the FBI agents everything, Richard. I told them you forced me to sign those property deeds. I told them I thought the money was from legitimate bonuses. I claimed total ignorance, and I am cooperating fully to secure immunity. Richard stared at her, the ultimate betrayal washing over him. The young, beautiful woman he had thrown away his 12-year marriage for, the woman he thought worshipped him, was handing him over to the feds without a second thought to save her own skin. You're turning state's evidence, he whispered, the reality of his total isolation crushing him. I'm surviving, Jessica said coldly. She grabbed her coat and her purse. My lawyer advised me not to be in the same room as you. Leave your key on the counter. And Richard, don't ever contact me again. She walked out the door, the heavy click of the latch sounding like a prison cell slamming shut. Richard Calloway was completely, utterly alone. While Richard's world burned to ashes, Sarah Calloway's world was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt from the ground up. The morning after the courtroom explosion, Sarah sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of William Cole, the court-appointed receiver. Cole was a meticulous, grey-haired man who specialized in untangling the financial messes of disgraced executives. Spread across his desk were the shattered fragments of Calloway logistics. It's a disaster, Mrs. Calloway, Cole sighed, rubbing his temples. The double-billing scheme alienated their top 3 clients. When the news of the FBI raid broke, 2 of them immediately cancelled their contracts. The company is hemorrhaging cash, the employees are panicked, and the supply chain partners are demanding upfront payments because our credit rating is now effectively 0. Sarah looked at the sprawling organizational charts and the terrifyingly red balance sheets. A week ago, she would have felt overwhelmed. A week ago, she was the discarded wife, begging for a fraction of her own life. But today, a fierce, protective fire burned in her chest. This was the company she had helped build in a freezing, leaky warehouse. She knew the routes. She knew the logistics software. She knew the drivers. We don't need the top 3 clients to survive, Sarah said suddenly, her voice steady and commanding. She leaned over the desk and pointed to a smaller column on the spreadsheet. Look at this tier. The mid-level regional distributors. Richard ignored them because the profit margins weren't glamorous enough to fund his ego. But they are steady, reliable, and they pay on a 30-day net cycle. Cole looked up, surprised by her fluency in the company's operational metrics. You know the routing logistics? I designed the initial routing architecture 12 years ago, Mr. Cole, Sarah replied, holding his gaze. I drafted the blueprints for our first 3 distribution hubs. Richard was the salesman. I was the architect. The company is fundamentally sound. It's just been poisoned by greed at the top. Cole leaned back in his chair, evaluating her. The court mandate allows me to appoint temporary operational leadership to stabilize the asset value. I need someone who understands the bones of this beast, someone the employees might actually trust, instead of another suit from a consulting firm. He paused. Are you offering to step in, Mrs. Calloway? Sarah thought of Richard's patronizing smile in the kitchen, telling her she only picked out the drapes. I'm not offering to step in, Mr. Cole, Sarah said, a cool, unbreakable resolve settling over her. I'm telling you that I am taking my company back. The criminal proceedings against Richard Calloway did not end in a blaze of dramatic courtroom glory. They ended with a pathetic whimper in a windowless conference room in the federal courthouse. Without the stolen millions to fund a high-powered defense, and with Jessica Croft providing a mountain of cooperative testimony regarding his real estate fraud, Richard was utterly defenseless. His court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed and pragmatic, gave him a brutal reality check. They have you dead to rights on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of tax evasion, and 1 massive count of perjury, the exhausted public defender explained, sliding a dense stack of paper across the metal table. If we take this to trial, you are looking at 20 years minimum. They are offering a plea deal. 6 years in a medium-security federal correctional institution, followed by 5 years of supervised release and complete forfeiture of all assets tied to Crescent Holdings to pay restitution. Richard, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame, stared blindly at the document. The arrogance that had defined his existence was completely hollowed out. He had spent the last 4 months in a county holding cell, a stark contrast to the Michelin-starred restaurants and private jets he once commanded. 6 years, Richard rasped, his hands shaking. I'll be nearly 50 when I get out. I'll have nothing. You have nothing right now, Richard, the lawyer said flatly. Sign the paper. It's the only way you see the outside of a cell before you're a senior citizen. With a trembling hand, Richard Calloway signed his name. It was a stark, miserable echo of the signature he had watched Sarah provide months earlier, back when he thought he was the master of the universe. The finalization of the divorce occurred a month later, presided over once again by Judge Thomas Braddock. This time, Richard appeared via video link from the correctional facility. He looked haggard, his eyes completely defeated. Evelyn Reed stood next to Sarah, looking profoundly satisfied. Given the unprecedented level of financial fraud and the egregious dissipation of marital assets, Judge Braddock intoned, reading from the final decree, I am awarding the petitioner, Sarah Calloway, 100% equity in Calloway Logistics. Furthermore, the Winnetka estate, its contents, and all remaining legitimate liquid assets previously held jointly are awarded solely to the petitioner. Braddock looked up at the monitor, showing Richard's slumped figure. Mr. Calloway, you attempted to leave your wife destitute. By the sheer force of your own hubris, you have accomplished that exact fate for yourself. The marriage is dissolved. We are adjourned. The screen went black. It was finally, truly over. A year later, the crisp autumn air returned to Winnetka, Illinois. The trees bordering the sprawling Tudor estate were once again turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sarah stood on the back patio, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the morning mist roll off the manicured lawn. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of a broken marriage. It was the peaceful, solid silence of sanctuary. She wasn't the discarded wife fading into obscurity. She was the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. She had rebranded the company the day she took full control. She had spent the last 12 months working grueling 80-hour weeks, personally visiting every warehouse, apologizing to the defrauded clients, and renegotiating the contracts. She had slashed executive bonuses, raised driver pay, and pivoted the company's focus to regional, sustainable growth. It had been the hardest year of her life, but as she looked at the quarterly reports sitting on her patio table, showing the company's first legitimate profit margin in 3 years, she felt a profound sense of pride. She had not only survived Richard's trap, she had dismantled it and built an empire from the scrap metal. Evelyn Reed's car pulled up the long driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. Evelyn stepped out, carrying a thick manila envelope, though this one looked far less threatening than the one Richard had dropped on the kitchen counter so long ago. "Morning, Sarah," Evelyn called out, walking up the patio steps. "I have the final civil restitution paperwork from the federal receiver. The funds from the sale of Jessica Croft's properties have been successfully routed back into Vanguard's operating accounts." "Thank you, Evelyn," Sarah said, taking the envelope. "For everything. Evelyn smiled, looking at the vibrant, powerful woman standing before her. You did the hard part, Sarah. You fought back. Most people would have just signed that paper and walked away. I did sign it, Sarah replied softly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. I just made sure the right person paid the price for the ink. She turned and looked out at the estate she now owned outright. She had lost a husband, but she had found herself. And as the morning sun broke through the autumn clouds, illuminating the golden leaves, Sarah Calloway knew with absolute certainty that her life wasn't over. It had only just begun. The scrape of a pen on paper is a mundane sound, yet it holds the power to dismantle lives or ignite revolutions. Sarah Calloway's journey from a discarded spouse to a triumphant CEO is a testament to the fact that true power does not reside in arrogance, hidden ledgers, or offshore accounts. It resides in quiet resilience, the courage to face absolute ruin, and the intelligence to turn an oppressor's hubris into their ultimate downfall. Richard Calloway believed he was orchestrating a masterpiece of deception, but he merely constructed the perfectly engineered trap for his own demise. In the end, the system he tried to manipulate became the very instrument of his destruction. Sarah didn't just survive the devastating betrayal designed to break her. She leveraged the ashes of her old life to forge an unbreakable, independent future, proving that the most dangerous person in a courtroom is never the loudest, but the one who knows the whole truth.